Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Rachel Friars, who is a doctoral candidate in our graduate program. I can't wait to chat um, with Rachel about the wonderful PowerPoint she created after several fun brainstorming sessions on our part. And I want to compliment her because it's entirely owing to her, the extraordinary clarity with which the PowerPoint has been presented. I think the PowerPoint is designed to provoke, to enlighten, and ever so nicely offend. What do you think, Rachel?
I think that's a really, really great characterization of the PowerPoint. And thank you so very much for inviting me to talk today. I'm really, really excited to chat with you and then chat with the students later on. But that's what I wanted to do with the PowerPoint. I wanted to take some really important examples after we've done that kind of critical foundation, take those examples and unsettle maybe some of the boundaries that the Norton edition and those textbooks set up.
Let's introduce a more personal touch to this conversation. How did you come to be interested in the Victorian period? Do you want to tell us a story about how that happened?
So this is an excellent question, and I don't feel like it's one that we as scholars get asked enough because it is always kind of interesting. So when I was thinking about this, I was originally going to talk about how I was fortunate enough to do my undergrad during the Bronte bicentennials, and that really drew me into, I mean, this is the pillar portrait over my shoulder here, and then Charlotte Bronte's portrait is behind me also. So that really drew me into the academic side of things, but really my interest in the 19th century and the Victorian period happened much earlier than that. I think I was probably about 16, and I grew up in a very, very tiny town in New Brunswick. And a very good friend of mine was in a production of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. And I had never heard of Oscar Wilde before, never heard of this play. And the only reason I went was because she was in it. And so it was sort of a, well, you have to support her, you might as well go. And it was in my high school auditorium. I so vividly remember. And I sat down and watched the production, and it truly was just revolutionary for me. And I had no context for it, but it was so funny and so sharp. And I thought, whatever this is, I want to do it forever. And at that point, I had planned to do an arts degree with the idea of going to law school and becoming a lawyer. And I didn't know that, this could be your job. You could do this for a living. But after that night, I became really determined to figure out how I could. And so that really started my love of the 19th century. And I've never left it behind since.
I can totally see how contemplating a profession as a lawyer wouldn't have allowed you to indulge in the wit that Oscar
Exactly.
Wilde kind of made so famous. I wanted to say to you that I deliberately, in the questions that I shared with you earlier, used the Baskerville font because that was my way of indicating to you where my interest in the Victorian period came from reading Sherlock Holmes. So it's interesting how, there are so many different ways in which one can enter this period. I did want to ask you, though, if you hadn't gone with the Victorian period or with the dissertation topic that we're going to talk about later that you're now exploring, which part of the Victorian period would have attracted you, or which other literary historical period would have been the place where you would have come into your own?
This is another great question that I don't feel like we're asked enough because I'm fortunate to have a lot of interest, and I was really contemplating where I would have sort of landed project wise. And I think what I probably would have done is, and we'll see shades of this in the PowerPoint, I probably would have worked either on women's diaries and life writing in this period because I'm so interested in the effect those have, and I'm a huge fan of archival work when I get to do it. or I would have worked probably on 19th century pornography and erotica, because I get to do a little bit of that with my current project, but I'm totally fascinated by what we'll talk about with Stephen Marcus and the idea of pornography as an industry in this period and how it actually works. So that's probably where I would have landed. I don't know if I could have escaped the kind of gender sexuality studies that I'm really interested in, but that's kind of generally what I would have wanted to do and still fantasize about doing in the future.
That's so interesting, because we're just kind of emerging from a discussion of the Romantic period, where what we've been talking about is sensibility, and what you're raising in talking about your interests in erotica, for example, is that we're moving to the terrain of the sensory, which a puritanical Victorian period apparently repressed, right? So it's a great way to make a transition, I think, from the class's discussion of the Romantic period thus far to what you're going to bring to our attention. So tell us a little bit about why you think it's important to approach the age with a queer eye. So what motivates your curiosities about the period, right? One of the things that I'm thinking about is that what you're suggesting is a specific angle on the period, rather than looking for specific objects or texts in the period that you want to focus on. So your queer eye, in a way, takes in everything that the period has to offer. So I was curious about why you think that matters, both to you and to everyone else.
I think that, and this in your questions that you sent me, you mentioned the Norton introduction, and how that sort of broadly contextualizes either the Victorian period or the Romantic period by focusing on some key events, generalized discussions. And I really don't envy those people who have to write those introductions, because it's extremely difficult to contextualize, 125 years in a few paragraphs. And so I think what I find reactionary about the way that my method works and the way that focusing on the smaller or the more individual aspects of queer life in the 19th century is that it really contradicts, or it really highlights, how disruptive queer identity can be in this period. So it's impossible, of course, to conceptualize an entire period in a few paragraphs, but it's also important to note that the way that that is usually done is through these white heterosexist lenses. And so if we think about queer identity as primarily about disruption, about disturbing those normative boundaries, it's really interesting to focus on those individual lives in the context of the whole of the 19th century. And it's also important to focus on the microcosmic elements, because it's different for every person in every period. And that nuance, that difference, and those commonalities we can find make for so much more disruption and disturb those normative. We can't make any definitive statements about queerness in the 19th century. And that's can be very dangerous or frustrating as a critic, but it also means, and we'll see this with the examples in the PowerPoint, that we can think about queer in a number of different ways and avenues, and we can find it and read it in the context of those Norton introduction ideas about the 19th century. And I really, really, really like doing that.
So that story that the Norton introduction tells shifts, for example, is altered, and exactly what you say acquires a kind of nuance and particularity that would otherwise be missed, because the Norton editors had this, unenviable task of trying to capture the whole range of what the period has to offer. So your microcosmic approach allows you to not only disturb and interrupt the story the Norton tells, but also transform it significantly, so that we see the very richness of the period, that the kind of flat description that the Norton introduction is forced to give can be perceived, in a much more enriching and enlightening fashion. So let's go to that specificity then. I just wanted to ask you, why did you end the title of your presentation with a question mark?
So I want to encourage the kind of, and this might be a bit of, like a little too linguistic, but I want to encourage the kind of confusion, the kind of exploration, the kind of unfinished sentence. If there's a question mark, there has to be an answer, but maybe there isn't an answer. And certainly, I don't know if we've in the PowerPoint provided a complete answer to this question. So I want to destabilize the maybe broad, and getting back to these Norton introductions, I want to destabilize the broad perceptions of the 19th century in terms of the Romantic and Victorian period. But I also want to explore the ways that they are confirmed in the way that people view themselves and the way that they were integrated into these social systems that are really dominant in the period. So the question mark is basically, I don't want to preclude any further discussion. I don't want to close off any thought, because I think this period is very complicated and it has a lot of, as I said, nuance. And so the question mark is really working hard to illustrate that. It broadly illustrates like what is going on here. How can we think about this period in ways that are both critical but also open to different avenues of consideration? So the question mark, it's doing a lot there.
I think that what you're suggesting to me allows us perhaps to think of what the course is trying to do in a different way, because as you know, this is a course that exploring the complex interrelations between literary and social history. So what do you think are the advantages? And here I want you to think not so much about the queer eye that I talked about, but a kind of queer methodology to approach telling the story of literary and social history, right? So instead of, for example, taking a chronological approach and saying the Romantic period thought this, the Victorian period came along and blew them out of the water, and then the modernists came along and took us in a whole new direction. So that's a very neat structure, right? It's logical, it's evolutionary, it's progressive, and it works very simply, according to chronology. The Romantics came first, then came the Victorians, and then came the modernists. So how do you think queer methodology might help us understand or tell a different story about these relationships between literary and social history?
So this is a really interesting question, and I think it's important. Maybe I can make like a genealogical metaphor here. We're thinking of the Romantics as the parents of the Victorians as the parents of modernists, and so on and so forth. And queer, inevitably disrupts that kind of genealogy. So I'm thinking a lot about influence. The queer identity is, as I already have said, it's hard to define. It's different across periods and literary production. But it also has this kind of, because of its ability to morph and change, it resists that linearity. It resists that temporal kind of binding and genealogical indebtedness. So I think there's certainly a lot to be said about the reflection of social history in the literary production of the period. And it's important to think about, and I think, Sarah Waters says this, like, sexuality is never fixed, gender is never fixed. And so it's important to think beyond, think about those concepts when we're thinking about literary periods. if we want to depend on that disruption of the queer body and the disruption of queer identity to these normative conceptions of how we think about literary history, then we have to think about how those categories are never fixed and they're always being recapitulated in queer literature. So I'm very much of the camp that disciplinary boundaries sometimes close off, they close some doors in terms of the way we think about the way that these periods sort of infect each other. And we'll talk about Anne Lister, but Anne Lister is a great example because she's born in 1791 and dies in 1840. So she has this sort of slight cross into those periods, and where do we place her? And in my head, I don't really think that it matters. And so that's the way I sort of think about it. And as a neo-Victorianist, we're encouraged to think that neo-Victorian literature is not bound by the date of 1837. It's really not. And so I've sort of abandoned that now in my own work to think more broadly about the entire period and the way that it truly bleeds into one another and the way that queerness celebrates that disruption.
I was thinking too, when you were talking, that what you're suggesting is that queerness transgresses not only the boundaries of gender and sexuality or masculinity and femininity, but also temporal boundaries, right? So that the example you just gave of Anne Lister, she's kind of straddling two worlds. She's neither romantic nor Victorian exclusively. And so it also evokes another aspect of queerness, which is a kind of in-betweenness, right? It's undecidable. And it's ambiguous in all of the wonderful ways in which things are ambiguous. So, so there's an element of mystery and enigma to it, but there's also a way in which it's unsettling when we imagine it. I was also wondering if you think it's appropriate to maybe think of what you're talking about in terms of two other models that I can think of, because you brought up the parenting metaphor or the parental metaphor. I was thinking of Edward Said's distinction between filiation and affiliation. So in part, what he's talking about is that it's customary for us to think of things in terms of inheritance, right? So the point you were raising about influence, it's what sons and daughters inherit from mothers and fathers. So that's a kind of standard way in which we understand the progression of history. But of course, on the one hand, it doesn't make room for repetition, right? That there could be continuities between periods because we're always thinking of them as somehow starkly different, you know, from the other. But the other model I was thinking of is that of Deleuze and assemblages and networks, right? And that's what Said kind of implies with affiliation, because affiliations can cross boundaries of class, of race, of gender. They can also cross boundaries of time and space. And we know this from the lives we live these days, right, where we're all global subjects in some way because our friendships cross those boundaries in all sorts of ways. So does that feel fair to you as kind of complementary models for what you're thinking about where queerness is concerned?
Yes, I think that's fascinating. And I think it puts me in mind of, and I'm coming back to Lister because we're almost to her. But
well, you love her, so why not?
I also love her. But what's interesting about this idea of influence versus affiliation is that the real interest in Lister, like the real focus on her, well, she's referred to as the first modern lesbian, but she's enjoyed this huge surge of popularity amongst lesbians. And so there's this idea that in ourselves, we see Anne Lister because her desire and her conception of herself is very relevant to us. It's recognizable to us. But at the same time, it is different. So it's not quite an influence, right? It's not quite a parent-child, but it's an affiliation. It's a connection. It's not so much as a an influence. So I think that's very interesting, because a lot of people in their devotion to Anne Lister's conception of herself will leave behind certain aspects of how Lister saw herself. And so that affiliation, that model, basically, I agree, that model makes a lot of sense.
I guess Sarah Waters would use the word affinity for that, right? So that
exactly,
it's a connection that is not complete. It's not an identification with Lister's position, but a feeling, you know,
exactly.
that I wanted to actually, because you're talking about these things, I thought it might be cool for us to attend to the glossary you provide at the beginning of the presentation, where you try to distinguish between terms such as homosexual, queer, homosocial. So I just wondered if you could offer literary historical examples, which you have already in the presentation, but maybe address those examples that you've offered in the light of this glossary. Is this glossary adequate, inadequate? What does it leave out? What does it leave in? Any reflections you might have there would be great.
So the glossary, I think, is very helpful for sort of trying to untangle some of the terms that crop up in the presentation, and indeed, you know, crop up in queer studies generally. Another word that I haven't added there that I actually might add later on is homoerotic. I for, you know, that totally flew out of my head for some reason. And so
of all things,
I know.
And a moment of Victorian repression there, Rachel.
I know. And so because homoerotic, homosexual, queer, all of these words, they can mean the same thing, and they can also mean completely different things. And so one great example, homoerotic is basically sexual attraction or sexual activity between members of the same sex, but it doesn't always constitute an identity. And so that's very important, especially when we're reading into texts in the 19th century. So a great example of that is Goblin Market. I would not classify that poem, and I would not, you know, charge Rossetti with having written that poem, you know, to say that this is a poem about two lesbians. I don't think that's really what's happening. But nevertheless, and we'll get to it, it has homoerotic connotations, extremely homoerotic, and that's still valuable for queer study. And in the case where the queer, homoerotic, homosexual, and all of those terms like that converge is with someone like Oscar Wilde. So we'll talk a little bit about the dandy, and, you know, not every dandy is a homosexual, and not every homosexual is a dandy, but there's a really interesting conflagration there that Wilde enjoys as an ability to express his sexual orientation. And so when the collapse of those terms happened, that's also really important. Queer, I think, is probably the most slippery of terms on that glossary, because first of all, it's enjoyed a huge shift in terms of its meaning in the last few years. So we have, you know, really just its meaning as being like odd in the 19th century, and then it moves into a slur. You know, it's directly addressed to LGBTQ people in a way that's, you know, has a really dark history, and now it's moved into a term that's been reclaimed, and it's a term that can mean so many different things in so many different contexts. And that's part of the reason why it's really exciting to apply it to the 19th century, because it allows us to fashion, even in contradiction with what the word means itself, to fashion a container for all of these different ways of articulating homoeroticism, homosociality, or homosexuality in this period. So yeah, it's very important to sort of note the nuance, and arguments can be made for any of those terms, to apply any of those terms. I'm sure there's people who would say, you know, death of the author to Rossetti, this is a lesbian poem, and it always has been. And so again, that's what's fun as critics and as people looking at this from a modern standpoint. So I hope that the glossary helps in terms of understanding the PowerPoint, but also in terms of taking a moment to pause and actually think about what these words mean in the context of the way we use them.
Yeah, I think you've made two very productive points from my perspective. One, that it's important to distinguish desire from identity. So that seems to me to be, or even orientation, which is, used to be the conventional way in which one described homosexuality. So that it's, what you're suggesting is closer to Freud's formulation of desire as polymorphous and perverse, right? It's not attached to the person who is exhibiting or experiencing that desire. It seems to have its own momentum, and the object of that desire can shift in unexpected ways. But I also loved your attention to the linguistic history of the word queer, right? So that if we think about the etymology of the word queer, that transition you described from being merely odd to being an active slur, like a derogatory term that could get people imprisoned, as it did Oscar Wilde. And its current kind of affirmative celebratory dimension. So it seems to me that tracing of the etymology is another kind of intriguing way in terms of methodology about rewriting the literary and social history that we're talking about, because we could just see that history embodied in language itself, right? So that the shifts in language would tell us a story about queerness. So I found those two ideas that you offered really compelling. But now I want to get to my favorite quotation, which is from Stephen Marcus. I want you to take us on a journey through the wonderful diction in that passage.
So this quotation, when I was going back through my notes on Marcus, and the entire text is really worth reading. It's a little dated at this point, but so much of what he says is so spot on. And this quotation is really key to get at, first of all, Marcus's general argument, but also what's actually happening in the 19th century in terms of sexuality and its kind of regulation in this period. So he does this sort of back and forth push and pull unpacking of what's going on in the 19th century. And he talks about the dominant voice of culture and what the dominant voice of culture is saying in response to the subculture of sexuality and erotica and pornography and sex acts and all of that that's happening in the 19th century. And that encapsulates Marcus's argument, which is basically that there are two tracks in the 19th century. One is the subculture of eroticism and pornography, and one is the dominant culture, which is seeking to repress, react, oppose it in sort of every possible fashion. And basically one cannot really exist without the other. They sort of define themselves in opposition to one another. And that's what's great about this Marcus quote, because he says, for every warning against masturbation issued by the official voice of culture, another work of pornography was published. For every cautionary statement against the harmful effects of sexual excess uttered by medical men, pornography represented copulation in excess. So he really, even just linguistically there, gets at the friction happening between these two strains of thinking and these two ideologies. And he also points out that they only live and they only exist in definition because of each other. So the, decrying sexual excess only happens because pornography is being published. And that is so interesting. It really frames the contradictions of the Victorian period in such explicit terms. And he also, I believe, and I meant to look this up, he talks about how, in a literal sense, in terms of print culture, pornography was being printed either on the same street, in the same building, in the basement of the places where mainstream literature was being printed.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah.
And so he literally takes you onto the streets of 19th century England and says, look at how this is happening. The mainstream literature is going out the front door and the pornography, maybe rather appropriately, is going out the back door. And so that he talks about how that actually works, and it's based on economy, it's based on industry, and he connects the way pornography is produced to this idea of, you know, the Industrial Revolution and capitalist production. And he talks about how all of these industries, this foundation, the other Victorians are actually creating the system that's going to bolster the dominant voice of culture that is opposing these things and resisting them at every turn. But they're only resisting them because they already exist.
I love the way it's encapsulated in his title, right? They're other, but they're still Victorians, you know, so he's saying that these two cultures, if you will, are simultaneous. So they're not just parallel, but they also coexist, and necessarily so, as you're suggesting. I also fell in love completely with his prose here, because it really performs the excesses he's talking about, right? So you really know where his sympathy lies. Just words like palpitation and menad, you know, the excessive hyperbolic quality of that diction kind of tells you, you know, where his sympathies lie, but they also simultaneously and subtly kind of mimic the titillation that dominant Victorians would have felt, right, in encountering these forms of pornography, because who was buying that pornography if it wasn't respectable sorts, right? So, so that's the part that I'm so struck by in your account, because nothing has really changed in our world. That's exactly how subcultures and dominant cultures operate, right? And they're both tied to the continual march of capitalism and industry. So that's fascinating too, that there's a link between sexuality and economy, as you're suggesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's what makes me believe Marcus so much when he talks about that, you know, the fact that pornography is now an industry. It becomes an industry and it stays that way. And it still continues in that vein. And yeah, it's really interesting. He also says that pornography is not literature, which is a really fascinating claim, and one that I sort of wrestle with. Yeah, it's interesting.
Particularly because we're talking about canonical literature, broadly speaking, right? So, you know, on what terms would pornography enter the canon? You know, which is a really provocative question to ask. I wanted you to say a little bit about the clip from Hysteria and how it illustrates Marcus's point. Because of course, when I watched this film, all I did was kind of roll on the floor in laughter, right? So I'm not sure I was taking it as seriously as I should have, but having read the Marcus quotation, I think there's something to be said for why this film, even though it was made in our times, is really crucial in its comprehension of Victorian sexuality. So I'd love you to say a little bit more about why you placed the clip there.
Yes. Okay. So Hysteria is a very hilarious film. I also find it very funny, and it works in kind of illustrating the way the Marcus quotation is laying out that friction or that push-pull between subculture and the dominant voice of culture. Because first of all, we're having kind of a conflation of the pornographic with the medical, and I love the way that works in this film, because I think that one of the ways that medicine integrates pornography and integrates the subculture is to make its own writings pornographic, and whether that's conscious or not. So I think that's happening, but it's also, there's this dissonance in the film between the way that medical men perceive what's happening in terms of female desire and female sexuality under the label of hysteria, and the way that the women think about their own experiences of desire. And so we see that kind of subculture bearing out in the way that the medical men are attempting to police this, but through their efforts to police are really encouraging or facilitating this subculture of eroticism. So I really like that film for its nuance. And I mean, it's also just, I'm a huge Hugh Dancy fan. And I think it's a very fun movie. And it illustrates that, eventually what's going to happen and what continues to happen is that this policing, this effort to control or regulate, as misguided as it is, becomes really couched in femininity and femaleness and the goals of regulating that excessiveness, that sexual excess that they're trying to control in the film, and through their efforts to control are encouraging.
I was thinking, because we're just reading Jane Austen's Love and Friendship, and the Norton introduction describes it as anarchic. And it seems to me that this film too takes that kind of giggly, hysterical approach to its subject. And it kind of tells you the ways in which humor and anarchy can actually be the conduit to discovering what is serious and moral, right? So that seems to me the real reason this film is a little gem. Well, we still have quite a few questions to get through, Rachel, because as you can tell, I'm very curious about what you come up with. I want to switch attention, because you brought up Anne Lister so often, and because our current discussion of hysteria focused on femaleness, but on heterosexual women. I wanted you to say a little bit more about the importance of addressing lesbian sexuality, right? So why couldn't lesbian sexuality simply be dumped under the category of queer, and simply as a way of giving women in a man's world, their due, so that it's just a matter of whether these women are gay or straight, doesn't matter, because they've been placed under this umbrella of queer as a kind of antidote to heterosexist norms, right? So I wanted you to say a bit more about what is it that is crucial in terms of lesbian sexuality's contribution to our rethinking of literary and social history, and literary and sexual history as well.
This is a great question, and I think it's one that, well, it's obviously it's very important to me, and I'm very biased in terms of what I work on, but there's a number of ways to answer the question. And I think one is to encourage a recognition of how extremely radical lesbian sexuality is for this period, not only because of its gender transgression, right, that resistance to these heterosexist frameworks, but also because, and this shocks people when I tell them, but lesbianism has never been illegal in Britain. And people sort of think, well, great, like isn't that great? But there's a reason, and it's because it's never really been a thought, right? It's been even more than male homosexuality, and that's really key to why I think we really have to embrace the division between the way these two sexualities were perceived in the period. It's a silence, and Foucault talks about how silence in itself is a discourse. And so I think it's crucial to reconsider, outside of the context of the medical, legal, social regulation of male homosexuality or male-centered desire, to consider how women in a discourse of silence were able to then articulate their desire in relation to modes that were available to them. And so Sharon Marcus will get at this idea of female marriages, modeling the marriage on heterosexist frameworks. And Martha Vicinis talks about this idea that women were encouraged and able to conceptualize their female-female attachment based on religious frameworks, because they're encouraged to invest in religion rather than in social, political, public systems of articulating desire. And so the nuance that's there, the really specific and female lesbian focused avenues of thinking about desire and articulating it, are precisely why this deserves the kind of study that it does, and why it can't be lumped in with either male homosexual panic or simply just, you know, queer. I think there's a real specificity there, and you run the risk of maybe divesting women and queer women in this period of their queer agency. And Sharon Marcus also talks about how, you know, there's a real power behind this, and it's part of the social fabric of the 19th century. And so that's sort of why I bring my scholarship to bear on this period, because I think it's integral to the way we consider relationships between people at the private level, because that's mostly where women were articulating them. And that's very different than, you know, the panic over the homosexual after 1870 and the medical legal restrictions, which are its own kind of burden to bear. But if silence is a discourse, what's happening in that discourse?
Yes. That's such a lovely answer. And it leads me directly actually to the Nortons' exclusion of Anne Lister, right? So shock, horror, you know, where is she? And I wanted you to think about what she would have added, right, to the Norton if she had been there, and if it had been possible to compare her with Michael Field, whom you mentioned later, and who does exist in the Norton, or with Swinburne's poem about hermaphroditism, hermaphroditism. Sorry, I mispronounced that. So my question there is, does Anne Lister for you challenge what you describe as Foucault's repressive hypothesis, right? And would you see that as her key contribution to rethinking lesbian sexuality and queer women in the period?
Yes, so Anne Lister is, I guess I love her, as you said earlier, Asha. And just to give a little bit of context, you know, she is an early 19th century figure. She was a world traveler, an anatomist. She was a landowner. She owned her estate and the land that the tenants farmed on. She collected rents. She was, you know, she was larger than life, really, for her time. And she was a lesbian. And we're very fortunate to have a set of diaries from her that are over 5 million words. So and the historiography of those diaries is very interesting, but we have this huge record of Anne Lister's life, not just for her sexuality, but for a real snapshot into the life of this landed gentlewoman who has done really so much for lesbian history in this period. So one of the things that's interesting about the diaries is that most of them, I would venture to say half, but I'm sure there's a statistic out there, are written in her own private code. So she was multilingual and used that skill to invent this code that she wrote her diaries in, that hide or conceal things that she doesn't want anyone else to read. And so most of what's in there is her very long, very intense, highly erotic relationships with women over the 40 or 50 years that she was alive. Some of them are married, some of them are not, and all of them are recounted in extreme detail, and that includes their you know, conflicts and fights, and it also includes their sex lives. And so it's truly, I mean, I can't remember who said this, but someone says, you know, it's the Dead Sea Scrolls of lesbian history. This archive of, we were here, we were able to do this without any language of our own. Within the discourse of silence, this is what happens. And it's very significant that it's also in a diary. So it is my dream to have Anne Lister excerpts included in a Norton edition, because they're integral to how we think about the 19th century. So I think in terms of the repressive hypothesis, this idea that, that no one could talk about sex and no one wanted to, and it was so highly regulated that the language is just not even there anymore by the time Anne Lister comes around, is, she blows it out of the water. She totally, she says, I don't have the language. I'm not quite sure what I am, but I know that I don't want to be with men. I know that I want to marry a woman and I won't accept anything less. And she goes so far as to invent words for lesbian sex acts. She refuses to engage with the silence. She refuses to participate in repression. And so she refutes what Foucault defines as this repressive hypothesis, that discourse changes to, shutter away sexuality and sex acts. And of course, he will refute that in his own work. But yeah, she's hugely interesting. But and when we were talking about affiliation, she's also very much a woman of her time. She was hugely angry. So in 1832, the first reform bill, I think it's 32, first reform bill is passed, that allows some men who don't own property to vote in England. And she was totally against that, totally thought that was absolutely ridiculous, partly because she, as a woman who owned property, still was not allowed to vote, but also because she was snobby. She was very, very interested in keeping the lower class where they were. And so when I talk about, accepting some parts of Lister and leaving other parts behind, that's what I mean. And so that's again why, I will campaign until the end of time to have her diaries included in an anthology, because that's crucial. And she wrote about things like that.
I love the way her presence in history gives us a great variation on we are here and we are queer, right? Like we were here and we are still queer, right? So it's a great way of thinking about that. I also loved the image you posted of her writing, right? So this page that gives us a life that has now become text. But I think what I was really interested in the evidence of her handwriting is as if that handwriting inscribes Anne Lister in history, right? There's no escaping from her. She's not just rumor. She's not just, a tale told by people that we may or may not believe, but that there's documentary, evidence of her existence.
Exactly.
I also wanted to address your point about, accepting parts of her and leaving the rest behind, because I think it raises a really important kind of general point when we think about one of the things we talked about in the Romantic period was, and this I think surprised many of the students in the class who were there when Professor Anthony Harding gave his guest lecture, because one of the things he suggested were all of the ways in which dissent, which was characteristic of the period, was unpunished often. Like people didn't actually suffer for their views in a way that let's say, as we mentioned earlier, Oscar Wilde did. So that idea is really, I think, important because on the one hand, it suggests why Lister was able to proceed with impunity and live the life, live out loud, as you suggested, writ large across the Romantic and Victorian landscape. But on the other hand, it also gets us to think about how whatever we deem radical isn't necessarily radically radical, right? That there are always ambivalences and complexities and contradictions in there. So here's someone who's breaking all sorts of rules and can't transgress the limits of class, and property. So this is particularly fascinating to me because one of the stories Professor Harding also told was the way in which women whose husbands were in debt had to accompany them to debtor's prison. You know, so Charlotte Smith began her career as a writer because she had no way to pay off her husband's debts and was imprisoned with him, right? So here's an interesting case of the relationship between class and literacy that Anne Lister tells a different kind of story about, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, these are just connections that are kind of flooding my mind at the moment as you talk, but it only reinforces, you know, why she was
Yeah.
so
And I mean, it's
fascinating.
great to, I mean, I love the comment you made about the diaries because that's part of what makes them so significant is that we have her inscribed in history, but in her own words
Yes,
and through her own
yes.
opinions. And so that's fascinating. And, you know, the encoded page, I did very briefly, I did some work with the Calderdale Archives, which houses her diaries, and they've been embarking on a very massive transcription project to get her diaries translated out of the code and transcribed. And so I, for a long time, knew the code and was able to read it. It is very difficult to do, very difficult to do. So anyway, that's just me being kind of an archival nerd, but really, really, really important. And yeah, I just love what you said. You're totally right.
Yeah. I love the way the coded nature of the diary is a kind of tongue-in-cheek nod to the clandestine nature, so to speak, of lesbian sexuality, right? So
Right.
there's just so much one can run with here. But I wanted to turn your attention to the other event that you mentioned, which is the Codrington divorce, equally fascinating for a whole set of, you know, other reasons. So could you tell us a bit more about why you think this event, so here you're not talking about text, but you're talking about event, was a kind of watershed moment in the queer history that you're trying to outline. And incidentally, I wondered whether you could see the Codrington divorce as a challenge to Sedgwick's model of the homosocial, because you have two women and a man rather than two men and a woman. So the triangulation of desire becomes fascinating here. So
Yes, yes. So the Codrington divorce is a really important event for queer history, and it's just important to me because I find it totally fascinating. So in 1864, Admiral Henry Codrington petitioned, sued his wife basically for divorce under the 1857 Divorce Act, because he accused her of adultery, of having an affair, multiple affairs actually, with military men in India. So this was huge. This was like big news in the 19th century because as an admiral, you know, that's being part of the Navy, he's basically a public figure. And so you have, you know, really wealthy people bringing their private business to bear in the court for matrimonial causes.
yeah.
And things get very messy very quickly. And so one of the ways things get very messy is that Helen Codrington brings in her friend Emily Faithfull, and Emily Faithfull lived with the Codringtons in the 1850s. Helen Codrington convinces, or somehow Emily Faithfull basically accuses Henry Codrington of sexually assaulting her when she lived with them in the 1850s. So this is a big deal because it means that Henry Codrington's claim for divorce is then unfounded because he is you know, a lout and a total dissolute, and he fails at being a husband. So in response to that, Henry Codrington says, well, here I have this sealed letter. And in this letter, which I gave to my brother in the 1850s, I'm listing the reasons why I actually asked Emily Faithfull to leave my home in the 1850s. And so what happens is, although the letter is never opened in court, Harry Codrington's defense attorney, or his representation, frames the letter as containing an accusation of lesbianism. So it basically, through this subtle phrasing, makes the public and the court believe that Emily Faithfull did something to encourage Helen Codrington to leave her marriage bed. So again, we have this private business of the home placed in the public arena but it's full of questions and insinuations and subtleties because the letter isn't ever opened in court. So Emily Faithfull, in response to these allegations, they're so visceral, they're so obvious, that she actually returns from out of the country where she's fled to avoid speaking about the sexual assault. She returns and testifies on behalf of Admiral Codrington and his attorneys. So she turns on Helen and says it never happened, in order to avoid having the letter opened in court and in order to save her reputation. So this is huge. It's very salacious. It's tabloid gossip, and it involves this subtle accusation of lesbian sexuality. And we don't know what the truth is about this situation. All of it seems very bizarre. And so I think the homosocial question is really interesting for this, because it does position Emily Faithfull and Admiral Codrington as sort of rivals for one woman who is also kind of a mystery presence. She actually disappears from the archive after the divorce is granted. And so I'm not really sure what to make of that, but I think it's so significant that this case contradicts what we assume about it contradicts the repressive hypothesis. It confirms in some ways that the discourse of silence is still there, it's still available, but the public is able to read into these accusations such that Emily Faithfull is compelled to return to defend her reputation. And so it shows us, and the Robert Browning quotation I included in the PowerPoint is great because it illustrates, what a huge gossip he was, and also how legible this was, how he won't repeat the allegation, but everybody knows that it's there. And Martha Vicinis says, the silence at the heart of this trial is lesbian sex. And so I wanted to include the Codrington divorce because it illustrates how linked, and Sharon Marcus talks about this, how linked Victorian marriage and homoeroticism, or female eroticism, is linked together, and also how legible in the public eye these kinds of discourses of desire were, even as they were being, prohibited and seen as wrong.
I wanted us to maybe move to the realm of literary analysis. So, this history is so fascinating in itself. It can be read as a text, but just so we can behave for a few minutes of this interview, I wanted to take you to the slide you offered from Goblin Market. And to comment a little bit about how the image and the text that you offer speak to each other, but also, why did you highlight some of the words in that text in red font? You clearly wanted us to pay attention to them, so
yes,
go for it.
Yes, okay. So the Rossetti poem is really interesting, both because it's just excellent. It's so much fun to read, and it offers us a number of readings. So here we have two sisters, Lizzie and Laura, who are at once related, but also friends, but then they're also kind of confused in terms of their subjectivities and identities, right? The Lizzie-Laura dichotomy is often confused. We don't know who is doing what at any time. And so that collapsed identity is, I think, very important. And we'll talk more about what that means when we get to Michael Field. But what I read this poem as is an unbridled expression of homoeroticism, right? The poem itself is about the risks of temptation. The goblins are an erotic kind of image around what it means to transgress, especially for women in this period. And we have, I can't remember her name, but the woman who did eat the fruit is now buried in the ground. She's dead, she's gone as a result of her transgression. And the only thing that saves either Lizzie or Laura, I can't even remember, the only thing that saves her is the presence of a sister. But the way that she is saved, the way that she is resurrected, we might think, is through this expression of homoeroticism, right? Did you miss me? Come and kiss me, never mind my bruises. Hug me, kiss me, suck my juices. I mean, I don't know who's saying that to me, but it's not my sister, so we can sort of think about the way that we can subtly read what's the savior image, right? This idea that, and this has been read in a number of different ways, right? It's been read as a mother-daughter imagery. It's been read as a Christ sinner image, all of that stuff. But the idea of two women who are, we can already barely tell them apart as it is, and they're connected through this sisterly relationship, which could be literal, but it also could be figurative. And then they're having this really erotic representation. And I think that later on in the poem, Laura's sort of ecstatic reaction to being saved is very orgasmic. So this to me is a very, very sexual moment at the end of the poem. And it's what ends up saving Laura from the goblin men. And so I think there's a lot at work with gender in this poem and a lot with eroticism. And I mean, you could write a whole dissertation on this poem, and I'm sure people have, but
yes, they have.
This idea of the woman as savior and the way that she is saved is through erotic expression and through this moment of you know, fluid exchange is so important, I think. And again, I wouldn't call this, you know, a lesbian poem. I don't think that Rossetti wrote it with that in mind, but the homoeroticism is really interesting in the context of the way that we're studying queer production.
It's also really modernist to me because which makes sense because she's writing it in, you know, in a transitional moment between the Victorian and modernist periods. But it strikes me as modernist precisely because of what you said, that on the one hand, this is a divided self, you know, because it's Laura and Lizzie, which is very symptomatic of modernist, you know, alienation from oneself. But on the other hand, the mirroring, the fact that these identities are indistinguishable, means that, you know, on the one hand, it's a mirror and a fused self, and on the other hand, it's a doppelganger, like the double. So it's really fascinating to me from that perspective as well, that it's ahead of its time in the way in which it imagines subjectivity and particularly female subjectivity, I think, because so much of the modernist discourse is also around the masquerade of female identity, right? Like the division between surface and depth. So you've got a mirror in this, but you've also got everything that it hides, which is the, you know, erotic desire, because you also have a buried female, you know, in it. So, so yeah, there's just so many ways in which one can come at this poem. Since you mentioned Field, I think my fascination with Field stems from what the difference is between the pseudonyms operations here, because one, you have a kind of impersonation of the masculine. Both names are usually male. It's a common practice in the period because you've got George Eliot, you've got the Brontes, etc., adopting masculine or male pseudonyms. But here it's compounded by the fact that we're actually thinking about aunt and niece. So it's not even a single person. It is a double person. And which one is Michael and which one is Field, right? So there are all of these questions. So I was just curious about what the difference would be between a queer pseudonym and a heterosexual pseudonym.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, Michael Field is totally fascinating as a figure at the end of this. I feel like I've said that about every single person I've talked
yeah,
about.
but speaking of incestuous, right? Like you've got one version in Goblin Market, and then here it's aunt and niece. Yeah.
Right. And so I think I love your point about this idea that male pseudonyms are not uncommon in this period for a number of different reasons, and the Brontes are famous for that, as you said. Michael Field is important in this context, and the reason it's different is because the pseudonym signifies something far, far more complex. It's like the iceberg, and everything that's underneath is really, really deep, because they actually they truly saw themselves as one identity and one subjectivity, and the things that they write, and this is reflected also in, they have a journal called Works and Days, like a collaborative journal that they write. They do this. They think about themselves as one person, one brain, one artistic sensibility. And so repeatedly they will, you know, and their writing practice is just fascinating. They will draft pages for each other, they'll rewrite, they'll, you know, they'll do all of this collaborative work that produces in the end these works of writing. So I think there's a huge difference there. It's not so much the ambition to be perceived as legitimate, as I think the Brontes can kind of be grouped into, but it's a reflection of their queerness, first of all, right? It's a male name, and maybe the legitimacy is a part of that, but it's also a reflection of truly how they felt about one another and how they felt about the way that their minds worked. And so I have on the slide here, and this is included in the Norton, which is great, because there are Nortons where Michael Field is not included.
So the Norton's learning.
The Norton is learning, and so maybe someday I will edit a Norton and I will help it along. So
we'll make a pitch to edit the Norton together. Yeah,
that would be great. So a girl, I love this poem, and I've read it many times for different things, and I certainly read this poem as an erotic one. I read a girl as a synonym or a euphemism, I guess, for female genitals, and I read that through, you know, a deep wave pearl representative of a soul, dim, lucent of all lovely mysteries, a face flowered for heart's ease, a brows graced soft as seas, seen through faint forest trees. I mean, this to me is clitoral, it's labial, it is, you know, it's totally,
it rocks.
It rocks. I love it. And so I read it very much through that lens, and the fact that, you know, two women who were lesbians, they were also aunt and niece, which is so complex, writing under this one pseudonym is really, really important. And then at the end, in the last 5 or so lines, we have, and our soul so knit, I leave a page half writ, the work begun will be to heaven's conception done, if she come to it. So it sort of says, I can only describe this so far before I can't actually get at the truth of it anymore. Our souls are coming together, and the poem just ends. It's really a great example of both the eroticism inherent in the way that they write, but also their actual shared subjectivity, which is erotic in and of itself. So their relationship is very complicated, and I encourage anyone to go and read about it. But again, it connects back to what you said about Lister, where, you know, her radicalism was sort of allowed to continue unchecked. And this happens here. There's some effort to keep them apart, but eventually they just end up together forever, and they die within months of each other.
Wow. That's deeply poignant. I also think that, you know, both Vicinus and Marcus speak of friendship and intimacy in the same breath that they speak of desire or eroticism. And I think the relationship between aunt and niece here, you know, expands the contours of intimacy, right? Because it's different from the affinity that we were talking about earlier, because that still implies a degree of distance. But here you have a bond that encompasses all of these things. Yeah, it's a friendship, it's kindred spirits, but it's also desire and erotic, right? In its formulation or articulation. So thank you so much for that comment on Field. It's going to certainly make me want to read more of their work. So this is going to be my question about your exploration of the dandy figure. And that figure has always been a source of utter fascination for me, because it suggests exactly the masquerade that I was talking about, that it's the clothes that make the man. And it must have to do with my long life kind of interest in fashion. But I like the word that you use in the PowerPoint is the word exquisite, which, so that it's not an adjective here, it's a noun. And that really intrigues me, because it suggests that the dandy is about identity really being about style. And so it's an aesthetic rather than a mode of being, right? So there's something simultaneously or the very faux nature of this identity, because it lies in the clothes and in the style, is exactly what makes it exquisite, right? So so could you say more about why you picked the images you did in the PowerPoint? What are the ways in which Oscar Wilde can be thought of in terms of a queer aesthetic rather than a queer identity?
Yeah, so I know, Asha, that you and I had sort of talked about, like, we can't have a presentation on Victorian queerness without mentioning Oscar Wilde. And that is very, very true. But even beyond that sort of necessity in talking about him, I really think that the idea of the dandy and this idea of self-fashioning and in erotic expression through clothing is so reflective of contemporary iterations of queerness. If you move as a queer person in the world, then you understand how important appearance is in either concealing identity or reflecting it. And it hasn't changed. In the 19th century, this was really, really key. And Oscar Wilde is a great example of that. And I have a couple of illustrations on of Max Beerbohm and Oscar Wilde drawn as dandies, and these were published in I think both of them in Vogue, actually. So the dandy is a really legible figure in this period, and even before this. And so Oscar Wilde is an interesting example because he uses the figure of the dandy, this idea of being exquisite, of focusing on the exquisite, as a way to express his queerness, his opposition to dominant cultural modes. And he does that through a number of different ways. The famous flower, I think it's a carnation that he wears in his suit jacket. And all of this stuff is really important to the way that Oscar Wilde thought about himself and the way that he thought about what fashion and art should do at the end of the 19th century. And so he crafts himself into an object of the exquisite. And although he would say, art for art's sake, it does indicate a queer avenue of relating to the world. And this is particularly evident in his life in France. He was really beloved in France, and that's part of the reason, that's partly why he was perceived as so queer, because he was living in France and he was making his sexuality legible there through the way that he dressed. So I really think the dandy is interesting because it creates one of those important through lines between how queer expression works then and how it still works today. You're so right that clothes make the man, and we can connect this back to Anne Lister, because Lister, what's interesting about her is that any references she makes to her clothing are also always written in code. And it's never really clear why she feels that her discussion of what she wears needs to be encoded, but she dressed in a really gender bending way. She kind of she wears skirts, but she also wears suit jackets, and she sort of goes back and forth. And it really unsettles the people she's surrounded by. And she's constantly either publicly called out for that or criticized in private, but she refuses to sort of make any any compromises that way. And she also exclusively wears black after about 1816. So her refusal to wear any other color is related to her mourning for the love of her life who got married to a man in 1816 or 17. And she wore black and never wore anything else, or very rarely wore anything else as a result of that. So her clothing is explicitly connected to her sexuality and to her identity. And you know, she very much, there's articles now on this about how she interpreted her relationship to masculinity and gender in the world. And she was really influenced by people like Lord Byron and that kind of mad, bad, and dangerous to know, you know, aesthetic. And she also really saw herself as a kind of a gentleman, as certainly not a rake at all. She was really interested in being perceived as respectable, and her dress also reflects that. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but it's always important.
I'm so glad you mentioned the notion of the rake, because one of the things I was thinking of in your description of the dandy was that it gives us a whole new insight into the Regency fop that I love to read about, you know, like Beau Brummel in the Regency romances with which I grew up. And of course, this is a figure in Jane Austen as well, but also the rake from the Restoration period, right? So the Earl of Rochester and that whole notion of really combines the figure of the fop with the rake, you know, whereas Byron, I think you're quite right, stays within the parameters of the rake. But I think that there's a way in which these identities are, you know, subversive. That is, they're thumbing their nose at convention, but at the same time, they become convention because their sense of fashion then becomes all the rage, right? So I love that combination of circumstances that you're laying out. So before I ask you to make a couple of concluding remarks, would you like to say a couple of sentences about the clip from Gentleman Jack and its relationship to neo-Victorianism, which you're interested in and which your dissertation project is about?
Yeah, so my dissertation is widely about, it's basically a study of neo-Victorian lesbian literature after Sarah Waters, who is also included in this PowerPoint. And one of those productions is this new BBC television series based on the diaries of Anne Lister, and it's truly excellent. If you ever want to watch it, I couldn't recommend it enough. And so I've included the trailer here.
Saran Jones, what's
Saran
not to
Jones,
like?
I know, Saran Jones, just a cast of amazing people, and Sally Wainwright created it. And
yes, and she's my favorite writer.
Yes. So this series is fascinating because it's both had a real cultural effect. It's catapulted Anne Lister into the cultural mindset in terms of modernity and lesbian history. And that's why I think it's not going to be long before Anne Lister is included in these Norton editions. And so Sally Wainwright
have no choice.
No, and Sally Wainwright is really responsible for that. And so a couple of things that are interesting about the series is, first of all, it's making the private diaries public in a way that I think is interesting if you're fascinated by the ethical concerns of historical documents. But what it also does, it does a number of things, but what it also does is it literalizes the diaries by making the viewer a part of diary production. So there are moments where Anne Lister will look at the camera and talk. She will look at the camera and like share a private sort of expression, like "how stupid is this?" or something like that. She will read aspects of the diaries aloud while looking at the camera. And so there's all this breaking of the fourth wall that Anne Lister does that encourages us to think about the narrative as being produced, as being constructed, as being mitigated by Anne Lister's perspective. And it also encourages us to remember the diaries and remember the actual source text and how important it is to conceptions of Anne Lister's life and opinions well, the series starts in 1832. So that period is really important for Lister. So I love it. I think it's such a fascinating remediation or reinvestment in Lister's life. And I think Wainwright really got it right.
Rachel, I want to thank you so much for the way in which you've illustrated how the Victorian age haunts us, inspires us, and educates us. And so I want you to have the last word and perhaps take you back to the title of your presentation and let us know what you think now about the truth of that title. Were the Romantics wild and the Victorians chaste? Was it the other way around? Give us your last word on this.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the time and the platform to just talk ad nauseum about all of these things that I just spend all this time thinking about. I think I love to write and I love to read, but I also love to talk about books and about history and literature. So thank you. In terms of the title, this is really interesting because the title plays with our assumptions about these periods, right? The wild, reactionary, transgressive romantics who are, they're inventing the Gothic. They're pushing against all of these boundaries that the Enlightenment sets up. And at the same time, though, we have people like Anne Lister who don't want people to have the vote, so are they really as wild as we think? And how can we actually, how does the term wild actually limit how we think about this period? And the same thing with Victorians. And I think maybe actually more obviously this idea, this long-lived assumption of the Victorians as chaste, repressed, so fraught with sexual anxiety that they're just bursting the doors of asylums, that kind of thing. Like, we know from quotations like Marcus, from the Codrington trial, from any number of examples that homoeroticism and homosexuality was both alive and well in this period. And it was also very legible in a number of different contexts. So it would not have been alien to people reading Goblin Market that this was an erotic passage if they chose to read it that way. It would not have been illegible. And that holds true for any number of conceptions of desire and sexuality in the period. Like Marcus says, the dominant voice of culture only exists if the subculture also exists. And so that investment in pornographic production is really, and illustrates that. So the Victorians, by no means, if you take anything out of this presentation, the Victorians are not at all chaste. They are delighting in their unchaste status at every opportunity. And that's why we can have those neo-Victorian retellings that exacerbate or encourage a reading of the Victorians as really sexually engaged with their lives. So that's, I think the question mark is what's going to trouble those two terms. That's what I wanted it to do.
Thanks again, Rachel.
Thank you so very much, everyone.
And we can both look forward to what our English 200B class is going to ask us and how they're going to react to this presentation and to the PowerPoint. So I can't wait.
I can't wait either. Thank you.